Everybody, Finance 3303, Chapter 2 of the textbook that we have. It's a relatively short chapter. Determination of interest rates. Okay, chapter objectives. Apply the loanable funds theory to explain why interest rates change. Identify the most relevant factors that affect interest rate movements. Explain how to forecast rates. Um, this is a short chapter. It's going to fold into chapter 3 when it's chapter 3 has got more dimension to it, a little bit more work to it. Hang on, I have a cat making noise. Hang on. Okay, I'm back. All right, again, a short chapter. We'll go over some things. There's some terms that I really would prefer that we know, and some things that we could skip, so we'll get right into it. Okay, guys, so there's something called the loanable funds theory, and it's a major part of the chapter. And it's like basic economics. If supply and demand is going to come in. But just let's read this into the recording. The loanable funds theory, commonly used to explain interest rate movements, suggests that market interest rates are determined by factors controlling supply and demand for loanable funds. So consistent with this being a financial institutions class, we can imagine where, like if you recall, I said in chapter 1, um, when you make a deposit into a financial institution, you're kind of telling them that you don't need the money right now, especially if going into a savings account, and that you want the money safe. You just don't want to put all your money in a shoebox and put it in your closet. Transaction accounts are a little bit different. So you're sending a particular signal in a financial institution if you check savings versus checking. Checking, I'm assuming, as a banker of 40 plus years, put money in a checking account, that money is not going to stick around very long. Put money in a savings account, that's a different signal. It's like, well, you didn't put it in checking, you didn't put it in a transaction-oriented account. You want the money to stick around for a while, and the bank uses that as a signal to say, well, okay, from a lending standpoint, your checking balances are far less dependable than your savings balances. But this goes into that loanable funds theory of what money eventually gets loaned out, et cetera, et cetera. So going into the next couple of pages here. Okay, you've got household demands for loanable funds, and then you've got corporations' demand for loanable funds, and then you've got the government's demand for loanable funds. So imagine yourself wanting to borrow money, you want to buy a car. Imagine a corporation wanting to borrow money, they want to build a building or a warehouse or whatever, factory. And you got the government that uses money for everything and anything. But that's all pulling from a fairly fixed amount of money in the economy. And those are how this is going to affect the demand for those limited funds. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up. There's a demand curve. Okay, and I'm not going to put a demand curve on any exams or anything, but just understand this is a demand curve going back to our economics classes of a few years ago. And it's just drawing that as from an illustrative standpoint. All right, not a lot there. All right, so business demand of loanable funds, same story. And you're going to have the government's demand of loanable funds. Okay. And guys, a couple of things here that I want us to know or remember if you already know. It's interest inelastic. When you and I, our borrowing would slow down as it has in the past couple of years. We're in 2025 now, but just a few years ago, I had at work, 1.5% car loans for 4 years. And people borrowed money with those low rates. Now car loans are 8%. How come? Because the government or the Federal Reserve uh, raised interest rates very quickly, and the financial institutions had to respond to that. So we have less people wanting to borrow money at 8% than at 1.5%. Imagine that. So we have we've got loanable funds that are out there, but the demand for those loanable funds have been curtailed by higher prices. So when prices go up, we tend to buy less. Now, government doesn't have that. The government can print money and they can borrow money by issuing bonds, and they do. And it's interest inelastic. They're not so sensitive to what interest rate changes are. They're running the government, or at least that's the idea. So here you have an inelastic demand curve, the ones that are straight up. It's not the typical 45-degree downward sloping demand curve like you and I would face, or that businesses would face. And you got foreign demand for loanable funds. Just spending just a second on this, obviously you could have foreign borrowers from banks that are domiciled in the U.S., so they're branches of U.S. banks. Not spending a lot of times on what the foreigners want from our banking system, but just acknowledging that's out there. So the aggregate demand for loanable funds, what they're saying is generally a downward sloping demand curve if you add all these demands together. All right, so the supply side of loanable funds, we know what a supply curve looks like. And if you've forgotten, that's what it looks like there, an upward sloping supply curve. And then what we're going to do is who supplies loanable funds? Well, like I described very simply, and that's all we have to know, a very simple application of this is when you and I make a deposit. When businesses make a deposit, or in theory, when a government might make a deposit, it's not so much that they do a lot of that, but they do a lot of borrowing. Okay, so the equilibrium rate, they call it an algebraic representation. So I'm going to bring this up as on supply and demand, because it's the households, it's the businesses, it's the government, it's municipalities, it's foreign demands on loanable funds, and we have that equation right here, right? Okay, that's the whole demand aggregate against the aggregate supply. Okay, from all these sources, same story. And I'm not going to ask you to memorize necessarily all of these, but in general conversation, we would realize, who's putting pressure from a demand side and who's supplying the funds from a supply side. Let me erase these drawings. And bring this up a little bit so we can capture all this in the recording. But it's the same for each of those. Okay, demand and supply. And then we have the equilibrium rate. Okay, and guys, this is very, very general because you don't have, when people ask where are rates going, or what are interest rates doing, or what are the interest rates on in the economy? Well, there are so many. You have an interest rate on a car loan, or on a jet loan, on a boat, on a building, on real estate, on land, on jewelry, whatever you want to borrow money for, there's a rate. And that every financial institution can basically choose their own rates. They don't have to follow what the market is doing. A lot of times it depends on what is going on at the financial institution. So if they have a large depositor base where they just, swelled up the institution with a lot of deposits, and that happens, well, that you got oversupply and not a lot of demand, so the rate at that institution, or the rates, would tend to fall. They're trying to get some money loaned out there. So if we want to learn about what's going on here from the 50,000 foot mark, you're just going to see that the book is just trying to illustrate that there is a equilibrium that we learned about in economics, where supply equals demand, and then markets clear. That's all they're trying to get through here. All right, so factors that affect interest rates. Okay. Impact of economic growth on interest rates. So the factors are part of the economic growth. Factors also what I just had said, and just to reiterate, what is going on inside the financial institution. And I'm not seeing where I might have gone past it in some of the pages that we just did, but a term that I want us to understand a little bit better is what's called the crowding out argument, crowding out. And that is when the government comes in and runs huge deficits like it always is doing, and the debt is at a record level now, and it's only promising to go higher, is that the government borrows at such volume that it could basically soak up a lot of the available funds that you and I might have to borrow, but because they are interest inelastic, they could suck some of the available demand out, and with a limited supply, what would happen? Well, it would shift the demand curve, and it would tend to drive up rates. Now, if government just prints the money, well, we saw that the past couple of years with the inflation that happened after the solution for COVID was to do exactly that, borrow money at an enormous level through printing it, and then we had inflation. So the highest inflation in 40 years. So it's that had a direct impact. And I remember this as my degrees are in economics, and I remember learning about that crowding out argument, and it just okay, I understand what it is, and it's more theoretical than practical because the government knows what the available amount of loanable funds are. I mean, they know. So it's, they can just print the money. And especially when some of these crises hit, like the solution to come out of the credit crisis in 08, 09, or the solution to combat the economic downturn, which was caused by COVID, they printed the money and sent it out to everybody, and to sustain families and businesses and so on. Well, when all that money, trillions of dollars, got into the system, there wasn't a problem with supply of loanable funds. That tons and tons of money went out, and that's what drove interest rates so low. So crowding out is a good test question I'd like to forward in our first test, very possibly. Just want us to understand what that is. So we're showing there, very simple, just what I explained a minute ago. The demand curve shifts out and drives rates up. Okay, impact of inflation on rates. There it is. So we had, when inflation was increasing, the government solution was to increase rates to slow people's borrowing and make money more expensive. Even though there was tons of it out there, the Federal Reserve raised rates to try to slow the economy down and to combat inflation. But that's exactly what was happening over the past couple of years. And you and I felt the increase in inflation. We talked about it in our first class. And that's what's trying to be explained here in chapter 2. Very simple. And another easy thing for us to talk about is what's called the Fisher effect. So I'm thinking that we've not had this in any of our other classes, maybe money and banking. But the Fisher effect is you take the real interest rate, and when an economist uses the word real, it means that it doesn't have any inflation in it. So if you had the real interest rate and you added inflation, that becomes the nominal interest rate. Okay, so a very simple equation here. It's called the Fisher effect. Let's make sure we understand. You have the real interest rate that has no inflation. Then you add the inflation factor on there, and it would come the nominal rate, the rate that you and I would see if you called the financial institution and say, look, I'm getting ready to buy a car. What kind of rates do you have? I'm shopping around. I'm looking for a better rate. And then it gets back to the financial institution that has put their equation, at least in theory, somebody that's setting rates inside the institution is trying to put the ingredients together that matches the institution's appetite for risk or appetite for attracting new money or using existing money, and what do they want to use that on, or how they want to set up their loan portfolio, and all that goes into what produces a nominal rate. So if you call in somebody and say, what are your rates on cars? And a number comes out of their mouth, say 8%, well, that represents bank management setting their rates and also, competition. You can't have a rate that's higher than everybody else and expect to make loans. So it gets it gets complicated and it stays that way because rates are changing. Your competition is picking up on rates. I know friends of mine that are in banking, there's somebody that I've known for a long time, they'll call and say, boy, your rates are too high or your rates are great, but I'm going to compete with you and I'm going to lower my rates to beat yours. I'm maybe going to get more of the loan business than you get. People will tell you that to your face. So it's kind of a dog eat dog. If you want to loan some money out, you got to be very um, capable of moving your rates around and watching what the market does. But Fisher effect is this equation here, and it makes a good test question out of that just to make sure we're understanding what the point is. All right, but very simple otherwise. I mean, it just describes Fisher, who made up the equation, is just trying to describe a little bit of what happens there. So monetary policy on rates, well, who is in charge of monetary policy? The Federal Reserve. Okay, it's stated right at the top here. Federal Reserve can affect the supply of funds. It could increase or decrease because monetary policy is what? Interest rates and the money supply. So between the cost of money and the supply of money, the Fed can dial things in when it wants to, and it doesn't have to really worry about how it's going to affect anybody or anything. They have a goal, and they're using those two primary tools. We'll get into a couple of chapters on the Fed, but so some of this conversation is going to bleed into the discussion there. And I want to show you some graphs on what happened over the past couple of years and explain, just what, if we haven't seen it elsewhere, what monetary policy can do to rates. And it could increase them or decrease them. That's what monetary policy means. Right, here's a graph of U.S. interest rates over time, and again, what rates? What kind of rate are we talking about here? The Fed funds rate, and they're saying here the caption at the bottom of the graph is T-bills with a 1-year maturity. Okay, so they got specific here on the example, guys. You see in T-bills back in 06, right before the credit crisis, was obviously high, so you can get a 5% T-bill, then it went basically to zero. And this is monetary policy. Here's the recession line, this grayed in area, and we're seeing basically it hit a little bit of a blip right in here, but we're seeing what happens when a recession comes in. Interest rates are falling, so let's make sure we understand that as well. Interest rates are falling because the economy is getting weaker. Interest rates tend to be rising when the economy is getting stronger. And when the economy is getting stronger, more people, what does that mean? Well, a lot of people are working, they're earning money, they're using that money, they're typically spending the money, and they put demands on the supply. So that's when the Fed starts to increase rates, or the institutions do, to kind of slow the economy down. And it's effective. Monetary policy tends to work, not perfectly, but it tends to work when it's very active. What I liked is, when the Fed was not doing anything for like 10 years, and we didn't have a Fed watch like we have now. We're sitting right in the middle of the Fed being very active to try to tame inflation and make sure that the economy is running as best as it can. Now, they're limited naturally on the monetary policy side. And as we talked about in the first class a little bit, there's fiscal policy that is run by Congress. Some of these things could be pulling in the same direction, monetary and fiscal policy, or sometimes they're at odds with each other. And so right after COVID, they were at odds with each other. You had the Fed trying to slow the economy down and take the money supply down a bit to take the supply of loanable funds down after they increased it. And you have the federal government saying, well, we're just going to borrow more money and run up the deficit, and we're going to spend that money. So it was kind of, there were opposite effects there, and it makes things a little bit more difficult if entities within the government or doing exactly opposite things to modify the economy. Oh, here it is. No, the impact is the crowding out effect right here. So I knew that, I was thinking it was going to come up. I knew that would see it at some point. All right, the graph is not so important, but I wanted to get it inside of the recording. Okay. Impact on foreign flows. And that's a word about that. Okay, so the forecast of interest rates, let's see if they were doing the net present value in here, guys. Let me page this up. Okay, to forecast future interest rates, the net demand for funds should be the demand minus the supply. We're seeing that right in here, the net demand. And you see in all the demand ingredients minus all the supply ingredients, and you'll have a net demand for loanable funds or for funds in general. And I'm not so hung up on this. Just in a conceptual standpoint, it makes sense to us, and we don't have to dig any deeper in that. I'm not going to ask you what the equation is from a testing standpoint, just more of a conversational standpoint of what this chapter is trying to get across to us. Again, chapter 3, so we're at the end already, the summary. I'll leave this on the recording, but guys, it's just the conversation about when we get to the Fed, we'll go a little bit more deeply into this, but it's that's why the chapter is so short, because it's really covering the majority of it in other chapters with more specificity. So chapter 2, all wrapped up. Thanks for watching.